This is Tim Wainwright with the Cyber Kumite. Today's edition is You Should Be Purple Teaming Right Now. So this is a bit of a public service announcement. There's a lot of talk on purple teams right now, a lot of podcasts, a lot of information sessions and training that's available on this topic right now. And a lot of individuals still don't understand why should they be purple teaming and what is the context of purple teaming with other security assurance activities. So today on the Kumite, I'm going to cover some wisdom from the NIST cybersecurity framework and also a hard-learned life lesson from Darth Vader himself. So first of all, looking at NIST cybersecurity framework, most of us watching a podcast like this are very familiar with the idea of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And I do not think, I'm not a hammer looking for a nail where everything is solved by security testing. But for a long time in our industry, of course, there's different types of security testing that has been an effective solution to assessing how we're doing in different parts of the security program. In fact, far predating the NIST CSF itself, we've been doing some of these activities. What I want to encourage you to think about with purple teams, though, is that there are really three reasons and three things that we can take from the NIST CSF about why you should be purple teaming now. First is it is a more mature process when compared to some of the things that are a little bit more initial and traditional, like pen testing and hygiene. And when I say hygiene, I mean vulnerability management. I just didn't have enough room for that in my wheel. But the idea that pen testing and hygiene have been pretty good tools for us in the past at covering off on the concept of assessing your protect function, how hardened the environment is. And of course, most modern programs have already started to move past that mentality with an understanding that we can't prevent everything, right? So then, and this is where I really want to focus on, if you think about the contents of the NIST CSF framework, 108 controls at my last count, I think, give or take one or two. What's interesting about what NIST CSF is hinting at is that out of the 5 functions from identify through recover, protect and detect are the richest functions. What I mean by that is they have more controls combined in those 2 than all of the other 3 put together. So there's actually more depth. NIST CSF is telling us there's actually more to see, more to assess, more to test in those 2 functions. And those are, I think, subsequently also some of the greatest challenges we have. And this is where we start to think about MITRE ATT&CK framework, which I'll come back to a little bit, which helps us to especially understand how well we are doing in those 2 areas. The other lesson that I want to take from NIST CSF here is think about the sequence from identify through recover. I believe that that's a natural sequence. And this is my argument for why we should be doing more purple teams and less red teams right now. Not only does purple teams have more depth in protect and detect, as I just mentioned, but it really has a focus on assessing those 2 functions thoroughly. And respond comes afterwards. Now, I'm not going to say that red team doesn't do anything to assess your protect and detect functions, but it's really not its focus. Why? Because red team is focused on finding the path of least resistance into an environment. It's not trying to be comprehensive at all by its mission when it comes to protect and detect. It's just skimming those things. What red team is really good at is detecting the response function. Will the organization actually react? Will they see the signs of something stealthy and dedicated? And will that response function kick up and do its job? And I challenge to say, why would you spend a lot of time on that respond function if you haven't done a lot of homework and collaboration on the protect and detect functions first? So I think NIST CSF is telling us it's a signpost that purple teaming is here and now, and this is something that you should be doing. Now that we've had a little bit of preamble with some wisdom from the venerable NIST CSF framework, let's take a lesson from the dark side here too. What I have here is an instance of the free VECTR.io tool. And what I'm going to explain to you is how you can use this tool, but really just better understand the concepts of purple teaming by thinking about what purple teaming is actually trying to do in the context of a movie that most of us have seen. So I was watching, or I should say rewatching for the, I don't know how manyth time, the Star Wars series with my kids. And I won't tell you how old my kids are because you may judge me and think that I was showing them this series way too early. But the one thing I will caution you is if you're a parent and you're about to show young kids Star Wars, I want to remind you of 2 things. There are an extraordinary number of beheadings and maimings. And so if you're not ready to explain that, now there's not a lot of blood, there's not any profanity, but lots of heads and limbs flying. So that's my caution to you before you start rewatching Star Wars with your kids. But as I was watching Star Wars, I realized that, man, I love this sci-fi stuff, but there's also some really bad security in here, which is a little bit bananas when you consider that they can do like light speed travel, but they haven't actually applied basic security controls that we're already using in our century and in our galaxy. So I think as I was watching the movies, I was kind of getting a little bit frustrated at just how bad some of their security was. And it occurred to me that in true Purple Team's form, if the bad guys, if the Empire had used purple teaming as a technique, the rebels never would have been able to blow up the Death Star. And what I mean by that is, if the Empire had conducted systematic drills with test cases, even some that might map to the NIST cybersecurity, or sorry, that might map to MITRE ATT&CK framework, they could have wholly prevented on any occasion that the rebels had tried to blow up the Death Star. So what we can see here in VECTR is we can model out what are the scenarios that we're actually going to test against. And we can use kind of a fun little combination of sci-fi and actual security techniques and look at some of the individual kind of kill chain paths that we would take in order to, in the first part of my campaign, which is penetrating the Imperial security complex, which is actually goes back to the Rogue One movie. So basically my example here goes from Rogue One into the original Star Wars where they blow up the Death Star. We can actually map out what are some of the techniques that that the Empire could have done themselves based on what they would anticipate that the rebels would do. Starting to sound like attack framework, a little bit in reverse, because it actually is. So we can click on any of these panels and actually get some specific information on how to run this test case. So with Purple Teams, we're obviously combining and bringing together in a collaborative exercise, the red team and the blue team. And so on the red team panel here, we really want to fill in all of the information that we need in order to make this test case fully repeatable. So we want to talk about the technique that we're going to use, the MITRE phase that it maps to, the different types of tools that we're going to use. And in this case, this one's already completed. So we said, hey, we looked on Pastebin to find and used OSINT techniques on Pastebin to find force field codes just to see if they would work. Because why not, right? Like that shouldn't work. But when's the last time we tried doing it? And in Purple Teams, we use a phrase, inspect what you expect. So we think there's not going to be junk out there on OSINT like force field codes, but lo and behold, we found them, right? And we found that this wasn't detected when we tried to use them. The event source wasn't logged, and we have a little bit of a narrative on things that we could do to improve. So let me show you some more examples here. So we can follow this chain all the way down through, doing a biometric bypass of data center tower room, and to one of the things that I think is my most common headache in all of the Star Wars movies, which is when a little droid rolls up to a high security bunker, and it doesn't matter like what the droid's function is. It could be like a language droid, but it always has this little arm that can shoot out, plug into the thing, and do this brute force that always gets the good guys into the bunker. And that's bananas. This is a wholly preventable attack pattern that we actually have modern security controls, again, in our galaxy that work against this. And this is the type of thing that in Purple Team's fashion, the Empire should have been drilling against over and over again to make sure that if that happens, one, they block it, or, lock an account out like we would, right? Or detect that, send that to SIM. And so in this case, we have a really nice detailed, rich red team panel on what we're doing, of a description of what's the attack pattern that we want. Again, what does it map to? And here, even some specific PowerShell and command line that the red team operators can use side by side with the blue team operators. And this is where the tenet of sharing, collaboration, open book exam is extremely important with Purple Team. We want the red team, in this case, the operator, to teach the blue team everything they know about this attack pattern and even give them specific instructions so that it can be fully repeatable by the blue team. That way, the blue team, if they miss this one, which we saw in this case, yes, they can go back and work on this on their own. So they can develop their content, they can refine their SIM rules, they can refine their configurations for automatic lockouts and things like that, retest it themselves and show that they fixed this. The other collaborative thing that's part of a Purple Team is actually assigning and agreeing to what are the most important issues that we see through the exercise. So with red and blue side by side, they might say, wow, yeah, like this has got to be a top 10 fix priority. Oh, and by the way, we better put the fix before Vader finds out tag on this before we all get force choked for this happening yet again. So we can save the test case. So all of these different campaigns constitute the overall purple team. And you can see how my next one is, once the rebels have shown that they can get access to the Death Star plans, now they actually need to get them back home. They need to exfiltrate them. And in my mind, this is a whole separate campaign for what they need to do, right? So they need to, and this is from the scene in Rogue One when they're, you know, kind of on that planet and doing some of the silly stuff. They're in this giant computer tower, and for some reason, data storage is way crappier in that galaxy than it is in our galaxy. They have this massive data storage, and yet the Death Star is just on like one little disk. Like, what was in the rest of that thing? Like, the Death Star is like their most sophisticated thing. Like, what was in the rest of that tower besides dramatic effect? And then what are they doing when they're on the top of the tower? When they're trying to beam those things out, what are they doing other than command and control, C2 type of channels in order to try to exfiltrate that data? And then, of course, a couple of other classics here. And by the way, why didn't they just use their like voice communications? Like, why was it so difficult like to get this thing out of there? It made no sense with their current technology. But I want you to see here is that if we take this view of doing a side-by-side simulation and we record them in a structured way, you can also get some really rich reporting. And this is the type of thing that from your pen tests, from your red teams, from your vulnerability management, it's just a different type of metric and different type of visuals that you can get from doing these type of exercises. So this is what it breaks down to. The whole Rogue One campaign that I designed with some of my colleagues has really 32 test cases in it. All of those 32 test cases can map to different techniques in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and I'll show you how this tool helps us visualize that. But very simply, when we're thinking about what the results mean, we have three simple outcomes. We either didn't detect it, which is the unsuccessful outcome, or we blocked it, or we detected it. And either of those could be successful outcomes, because we know in security, we're not going to block everything, right? So if we record things in this fashion, we can start to get some really interesting statistics on our tool set. So we can see our force field X2, whatever that is pretty highly performing in our environment. It's responsible for more of the test cases, and we start to get some commentary on our tools that may be underperforming. We can also start to visualize across the kill chain what are, or MITRE tactics. We can kind of configure this either way. What are the things that we need to work on most? So let me show you a few more views here. We can do a test case drill down. So this is where, of all of the things that we did, we can start to really put those tags to work and say, well, you know, let's just focus on the things that we agreed are a top 10 fixed priority. And then this then becomes the work list, because one of the things that is an issue sometimes with blue teams is they know they generally need to be working on content, but they're not sure what to prioritize, because there's not something that came directly from an exercise like this that's well organized that says, team, this is what we really need to work on right now. These are the top 10 or the top 5 things that we have agreed by doing the simulation together side by side that we need to be better at. So we can get some of those types of visuals. And then we can do one of my favorites, which is the heat map view. And those of you who've spent time with MITRE ATT&CK framework know that there are a lot of techniques, and not all of them are created equal. It's exhaustive. We love it for that, but we're not trying to meet the intent of the entire framework at once. It's not like NIST CSF in that regard. So we need to be able to turn off and focus on the things that we just worked on in that one assessment. So in this case, we only have 30 some test cases. We're only lighting up so much of the MITRE ATT&CK framework in that case. But we can look at each of the individual cases that are here. I can click on either of these and bring up the red and blue team panels again. But this gives us a sense, and you can imagine as the Empire first does this for the Death Star, and then they do other simulations, and then other simulations. This is composite, and it creates a growing view of how well over time they're also aligning to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. What's cool about that too is then they can overlay other types of threats. So they may be concerned with the rebels, but we can also go to the MITRE filter feature here, blow through a bunch of APTs. There's kind of one specifically I think would be interesting to look at because everybody's talking about them. Here we go. Let's grab oil rig and do an oil rig overlay. So this now has then taken a cut and allows the Empire to ask the top-down question. Sure, we assessed our defenses against the rebels, but how does that intersect with what oil rig does as a known threat actor? And so we can see it's a smaller subset, but now we can toggle this and say, okay, if we need to get better at our coverage, what are some of the tactics that we really haven't touched yet? In this case, like execution and discovery and collection, and how do we shore these up? How do we create some test cases to directly correspond to getting better at meeting the collection of our threats? So that's what I wanted to show you. I'll say, may the force be with you as you take on this journey. Feel free to contact me. Welcome any of your comments on how to get started with purple teaming. And also, how can you get started with VECTR? Because this is a free tool, by the way, and it's something that anybody can use to start to plan out their campaigns.